As I mentioned in the previous presentation on the 1980s, though some groups of Americans benefited from Reagan's trickle-down economics, the reality was that the wealth did not trickle down to working class and poor Americans. The divorce rate in America hit a high peak right around 1980, which also affected children who grew up watching TV ads and programs that increasingly seemed to present a phony fantasy world, unlike the reality of family life these kids were experiencing. It's no surprise then that the 1990s would see a rise in popularity of another round of rebellious music. Alternative music can best be understood as a backlash against what had become the status quo in the popular music of the 1980s. But what was it an alternative to? How are we to understand this term? I suggest there are at least two ways to define alternative music. First, it is anti-commercial, underground, independent. It challenges the status quo, it's anti-mainstream, it's local instead of corporate, homemade instead of mass-produced, genuine, not artificial. These are all characteristics of the rebellious or protest music we have seen in previous forms of American pop music, especially in the beginning of new musical movements before the music finds mainstream success. But there's another way to understand what alternative music is. Alternative music is a category for marketing music, a tool for the record industry to capitalize on new music trends. Alternative music in this sense is what swing music was when it became popular. Swing was originally slang for when a party was really getting going or swinging, and then it became a name for a type of music, so the music industry could capitalize on it. The adjective was co-opted by the music industry and became a noun, an object to be bought and sold. In the 1990s, both ways of understanding alternative music were happening simultaneously. What's strange about this is that the two definitions conflict with each other. How can alternative music be anti-commercial and anti-mainstream if it's defined for mainstream audiences as a commercial product? This is the inescapable irony of the music. It's no surprise then that the predominant tone of much alternative music is irony. It's ironic that, as a senior executive for a major record company in the late 80s admitted, there's a whole indie section of our company, kids, that will only buy records that are on the indie label, which is why we sometimes concoct labels to try and fool them. In the alternative era, marketers had to get smart, had to find ways to sell products with an anti-corporate, anti-commercial message. Essentially, they had to try to fool kids into buying stuff as an act of rebellion against the buying stuff system. In a moment, we're going to take a look at Nirvana, a band that most clearly exemplifies this irony. But before we do, let's look at many of the significant alternative bands of the late 80s to mid-90s. Many of the first wave of alternative bands were understood to be college radio bands. That's because many of these bands, like REM, Violent Femmes, Husker Du, and The Replacements, didn't fit on commercial radio formats initially. They became popular through public radio stations based on college campuses. As these bands became more popular, commercial radio stations started to change formats to incorporate such bands, who became known as alternative bands. Sonic Youth is a very influential band known for using guitar distortion and layered guitars in unusual song structures. The Pixies had a spare, loud, then soft, then loud style that was hugely influential on bands like Nirvana. Ministry and Nine Inch Nails were part of an industrial rock sound that used machine sounds and computer technologies with some metal music techniques. Ani DiFranco was a darling of the indie world, with her cross-genre songs and a strong feminist message. Jane's Addiction was one of the first alternative bands to gain mainstream success, which paved the way for the acceptance of grunge, the Seattle sound, represented by Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and Nirvana. The Smashing Pumpkins had a grungy sound, but was from Chicago and captured the mood of 90s youth with the double album Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. An artist that combined hip-hop beats with alternative lyrics was Beck. The sound of alternative became more pop-like in the mid-90s with Alanis Morissette, a former Canadian pop star producing an alternative-sounding breakup album with several hit singles called Jagged Little Pill. The best example of the irony of the alternative music is the career of Nirvana and the rise of the so-called Seattle grunge sound. One of my favorite music documentaries is Nirvana's Live Sold Out. The film compiles video of live Nirvana performances, interviews, and home video to tell the story of Nirvana from the band's perspective. This is the band's take on what Nirvana is all about. And you can see from the title that the band is playing with the irony of their mainstream success. Live sold out is the phrase seen on the marquee to express a sold-out show, indicating the huge popularity of a band. But Nirvana are also making fun of this fact. The title has a double meaning. Sold out also has the negative implication, especially among alternative fans, of having lost the anti-corporate, anti-mainstream values of underground music. In the film, you see Nirvana's intentionally out-of-tune performance of Come As You Are. You also see Cobain enter the stage as an old man in a wheelchair, collapsing in front of the microphone, the antithesis of the youth-oriented music he's known for. And toward the end of the documentary, the band can be seen ramming their musical equipment into the cooling fans placed at the edge of the stage, perhaps a kind of wordplay on the band's frustration with their fans, who only want to hear the band's biggest hits. In this clip, you'll see Nirvana performing their biggest hit, Smells Like Teen Spirit, on a television show designed to highlight pop artists. Nirvana recognizes the irony that they are being highlighted on a top 40 TV show. And so they play up the ridiculousness by making it obvious that they were asked to pretend to play their instruments while the recorded track was heard underneath. This is the punk attitude at its best. Nirvana's success led to a gold rush of sorts on Seattle music. The music industry and other corporate entities saw an opportunity to exploit this new sound across the country. The experience of being set upon by the music industry and media is captured well in the documentary Hype. In this clip, you'll see the ways artists and music fans in Seattle dealt with the media hype of grunge with their own ironic stance. The frustration of many musicians and fans of alternative music was that they had become what they most hated. It seemed the punk attitude was no match for the American commercial machine. Alternative music had gone the way of early rock and roll, folk music, the British invasion, the hippie movement, 1970s punk, and disco. All had beginnings as a response to the boring, commercialized sound of mainstream music, and then became a mere product themselves, a commodity to be bought and sold. Yet, there was a general experience among young people that explained the rise in popularity of grunge and alternative music, according to Sub Pop co-owner Jonathan Poneman. He says, "A lot of people our age and younger have been brought up with these notions of Reagan-era fueled affluence. Then, when you suddenly see a lot of those dreams subside because of this particularly brutal recession and class warfare, race warfare, it makes you very angry, very fearful, very alienated. And those are qualities that lead to an unusually rebellious, passionate rock."